Good morning. This is the Saturday, August 20th edition of Noisy Reality, and the topic today will be the Russian military today, the war in Ukraine. We're very pleased to have Johan Norberg here to talk about this subject with us. Johan is a senior military analyst at Sweden's Defense Research Agency, where he's worked for the past several decades. He's previously worked at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in the Swedish Parliament, as well as having served as an officer in peace support operations in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Georgia, and the Middle East. He has authored many publications on the Russian military, including being the co-author of Russian Military Capability in a 10-Year Perspective 2019. Highly recommend that. Security in Central Asia 2019. Security in the Caucasus, Russian Policy and Military Posture, and many other publications. He has been a scholar at the Foreign Affairs Institute in Philadelphia, and he's also been a visiting scholar at Columbia University in New York City. It's a great pleasure to have Johan here today, and I want to welcome Johan. And of course, maybe we should do the caveat. These are his opinions only, and do not reflect the Defense Ministry of Sweden. I'm so used to doing that with DoD friends of mine. But anyway, Johan, welcome, and great to have you here this morning with us.
Thank you, Jim, for that very warm introduction, and thank you for sort of dealing with my caveats. But I will also add that these are my personal observations, also in the sense that I will take you into my approach to Russia as a military analyst before the war, and then also what we have seen so far, and what did we understand correctly before, and what did we not get correctly. So next slide, please. Yeah. So that's how we want to do it. How did we, FOI, assess future military capability? That's quite a tricky one, actually. Then some brief observation about the Russian armed forces in the first 6 months of the war. There is an abundance of information. I suppose this is the first war where we all can follow it in real time in our pockets, like with these. So what you want to listen to, who you want to listen to, there's an endless amount of information. And I have some observations that I've made, and I know that you probably have made others, and I look forward to hear your points. Then I'm going to sort of have a brief discussion on what did we get reasonably right and wrong. It might be a bit myopic as a methodological approach, and also some lessons learned on that. So, thanks. How did we use to assess future military capability? And this is the picture you see is our report that we did in 2019. When you assess something in a 10-year perspective, and what it could be at the end of that period, I think there is no force in the world that will completely change its whole inventory, all its stuff in 10 years' time. So it's very logical to start with, what does Russia have now if we're going to look at 2029? Because whatever there will be in 2029, much of it we can already see today. And if you look at the Russian armed forces today, 2022, they have very much of what they had in 2012. And by the way, 2002, 1992, and 1982 is very much a legacy army. I think all forces are, more or less. So in that description of the current situation, remember this is pre-war, we divide that into two things. First, what Russia has, what their armed forces consist of in terms of equipment, personnel, and crucially organization of the armed forces, military districts, combined arms armies, etc., etc. And then in a separate chapter we write what they can do. If we agree on the basic notion that war is about doing things, it's important to try to sort of separate what Russia has and what Russia can do. Most pieces I read mix the two in one all the time. It's very hard to see which is which. So we try to be a bit stringent with that, sort of separate them. And I will go for that, what they can do in 2019. I will sort of delve a bit deeper into just shortly. That is the description of the present, our current capabilities. Then I'm very proud to be, sorry, I forgot to say that I'm part of a team of scholars. It's about 10 of us deal with Russia. It's all open source, it's mainly Russian sources, and we look at Russia's military in a very broad perspective. It's not just military analysts like me and some of my colleagues, but we have economists, lawyers, political scientists, etc. In order to be able to address overall development factors that we know affect the creation and development of armed forces in a society. The first one is security policy. What threats do you perceive? What allies do you have and want? And what type of armed forces do you want in general to address these threats? Then you have economy and military expenditure. How much money do you have to actually spend on your forces, and how important is it vis-a-vis other spending you can have as a government, other types of spending you can have as a government? And finally, for the money you have, how much military equipment can you get over time? Deliveries, i.e. defense industry issues. You will already now spot sort of a deficiency here, and that we do not address manpower, sort of this softer issues. We simply couldn't fathom that in a proper way, partly because of we were short of staff, but it's a very difficult issue to start to address. I'll come back to that later. And then then sort of in the final chapter, we sort of take the present situation, 2019 military capability. We add these factors and see how it sort of pushed the future, this military capability into the future, and we land in a conclusion. So that's the report. You can read all about it. But before I go on to say what Russia's armed forces can do, I want to say a few words about military strategic preconditions for operations. Because doing something in war is actually carrying out operations, and geography plays a crucial role in that. So does enemy, and so does your own forces. And I'll go through some brief points about that. Here you see a map of the Russian Federation, sort of the light gray bit. The rest of the world is just darker gray. How wide is Russia from east to west? If somebody is whispering in the microphone that is switched off 9,000 kilometers, that is absolutely right. How far is that? And if you compare it to the west? Well, if you go to Rotterdam in Holland on Google Earth and then take a line, go west into the US, you end up in Kansas. So all across the Atlantic, halfway across the United States, that's domestic in Russia. We tend to forget how huge Russia is because you can get into a slide like this. So that's one thing. Another thing that is important with the geography is sort of we divide it into two categories, enabling and hindering. Enabling Russian operations for ground forces, the key asset on a sort of more strategic level is the railways. So you can actually transport forces between military districts and between various ends of Russia. You see the Russian gauge railway network as a sort of gray spider web-like thing behind, the sort of west of the Urals. East of the Urals, it's much less, which is very important. For naval forces and air forces, bases are important because Russia does not have any foreign bases except the one in Syria. So it cannot sort of count on that type of ability to project power elsewhere through its bases abroad. So air power and naval power is very much bound to Russia. It's self-explanatory. The circles with anchors, naval bases, and the blue triangles are military air bases. Hindering then sort of geographic challenges is that's distances, of course. We just talked about that. Mountains, especially alpine mountains, because if you have high alpine terrain, you cannot carry out big military operations. The Russians call it in a regional war. It's basically a fight with NATO and with China. But in some places, Russia will be stopped by geography. My favorite example is the Greater Caucasus Range. You can see it as a very dark gray line between the Black Sea and the Caspian. I served there as a military observer for the UN in 1996, and those mountains are high and steep. And there's no way in the world you can drive an army through that. There are some tunnels, yes, there are some mountain passes, but they are closed most of the year because of the snow. So that's an example where sort of terrain can stop you. And obviously seas are a limit to sort of major ground operations, which the Russians are actually what they actually do. You need a peer adversary to fight sort of a major regional war, because that's what we thought that the Russians were up to. Peer enemy would be NATO or China. But in between, we couldn't really figure out a peer enemy that would approach Russia to require a military response. Even if it came Turkey from the south and up with NATO and so on, they would also be stopped by the mountains in the Caucasus. And then Russia must have its own forces to fight a regional war. And to put it sort of a story very, very briefly, Russia has 75, 80-ish% of its forces west of the Urals. And I think this map shows that really well. There's a few triangles and 2 naval bases east of the Urals in the 8 time zones that are east of the Urals. And the 3 time zones that are west of the Urals basically have the rest. So in sum, could you please press the button, Jim? Russia has uniquely favorable military strategic preconditions for operations west of the Urals. And I would argue that nowhere are they so favorable as in Belarus and Ukraine. Well, they were until before the war. So this was how I saw the sort of chessboard of Russian military operations before the war. What would the chess pieces be then? The chess pieces would be groups of forces. It's not a military district that goes to fight a war. When the Russians go to war, they set up a group of forces. It could be based in a military district, but it's always tailored to task. It's a ground force-centric combined, as a joint force, but always ground forces. They're the biggest one. Russia's continental power, so ground forces is the key issue. Air and naval forces are very much in support of the major ground forces effort. Roughly 1 per military district. You can argue how that was done before Ukraine, and I'll come back to that later. The area of operations would be some 300 to 300 kilometers. I would say that that's roughly what they have taken in southern Ukraine at the moment. But sort of very, very generally. Then you can see various parts of such a group of forces. It could be, I mean, I won't go through the whole thing, but it is ground forces, the main thing, then air and naval forces in support. In the bottom right-hand corner, I'm sorry, it's a bit unclear now, but these can vary in size from about 60,000 to 130,000. So it's not very, I know it's not a very precise measurement, but just to point out that they are tailored to task. I'll come back to that figure a bit later on, but it can vary, right? So this is a chess piece, a group of forces. What could the game of chess look like? What we call Russian fighting power. How we derive that term, this can be read in the report. The point here is that Russia can launch 1 regional war at a time within a month. This is what we thought. Regional war is because it's based on sort of the amount of forces they have available. The timeline within a month was based on observation on Russian military exercises. To be more specific, is within a month in Western Russia. It's about 2 months in Eastern Russia due to distances and the time it takes to cobble together forces. And we thought that this would remain until 2029 because it would be extremely costly to build something more, having another group of forces to the 3 ones you have in the West and 1 in Central Russia and 1 in the Far East. You see the dotted blue and purple lines sort of at the end of the arrows, different direction. That's how far we assessed ground force and aerospace forces action could go. Basically on the observation, the end of Russian gauge railway lines and a few more 100 kilometers. So this is what my world looked like on February 23, which was, by the way, Defender of the Fatherland Day in Russia, Dien Защитника Отечества. And then the invasion came. And we have all followed it in detail. So Jim, next slide, please. And I'll just make some very, very, very brief observations, and I will come back to the details in the discussion, I hope. What can we say then after 6 months of war in Ukraine? If you look at my previous map, taking Ukraine it should be quite easy. You need 1 or 2, perhaps 2 groups of forces to do this. But it didn't turn out. It just sort of comes out that we clearly overestimated what we had seen. Perhaps that is due to having just Russian MOD as your source. Why did we choose that? Well, that was the only official source, and we know who the horse is when we get it from the horse's mouth. There's plenty of information about the Russian military out on the internet, but who's behind it? We don't know. I have changed my mind on that type of source now, but that's another discussion. Anyway, the Russian armed forces have underperformed compared to what we thought. Military problems include command and control coordination between services, logistics, etc., etc. The whole spring was full of one article after the other outlining all the problems it had. Political level, and I think that was the article that Jim sent out from Washington Post about the intelligence failure within the Russian system when they did the war planning. The GRU should have assessed Ukraine's will to fight better. The SVR should have assessed the reaction in the West better, but they didn't. They completely messed that up. So when their sort of brilliant plan of a quick coup, basically having the Crimea operation from 2014 rerun, but on a bigger scale, when that didn't work, then they apparently didn't have a plan B. As far as I know, and if anyone knows anything different, I would be happy to know. It seems to be a very odd guidance to operations once this thing got going from the political level. There was no appointed commander-in-chief of the operation, no commanding general until very late. It was after 6 weeks. I mean, I didn't know who was in charge of the operation. And crucially, they did not mobilize. I can understand there are political reasons for not carrying out mobilization. You cannot do that with only a special military operation. You only mobilize for war. But the size of Ukraine as a military task, as an assignment for a force to fight a war in, requires hundreds of thousands, not just 200,000, but 300, 400, 500,000. And Russia did not mobilize. That they didn't do it when they hoped everything would be over in 3-4 days. I understand that, but after that they should have mobilized on purely military grounds. But I'm not Russian politician, so I don't have to worry about that. I would say that the Russian armed forces have been fighting Soviet style, but not Soviet scale. It's a ground forces centric war. Well, obviously, if you want to take Ukraine's territory, it's going to be ground forces centric. It's a lot of artillery first, and then the maneuver with armor and infantry coming second. And it's very clear now that a key Russian challenge is the shortage of infantry soldiers. Just ordinary infantry that actually enable you to take and hold terrain. No matter how many fancy drones or aircraft you have, if you cannot take and hold terrain, this doesn't work. The Russians are fighting with hundreds of thousands of soldiers. I think there were upwards of 200,000 soldiers entering the Ukraine at the beginning of the war, according to American estimates. The Soviet army was to fight with millions. And why is this important? Well, I think they have still the mindset of how they view human life and soldiers as resource and assets, as expendable assets. Well, they are in most armies because they're expected to die at some point. But here they apparently seem to be careless, and they took heavy casualties. And I cannot help thinking sort of a neglect or negligence or sheer what's the English word? Arrogance could have been part of that. Another Soviet element that I see is the actual use of overwhelming firepower all the time. Artillery. If you don't know what to do, more artillery. And putting a huge strain on logistics, not achieving very much. It's also interesting that they have used more precision munitions than I thought they had, but that still has not achieved the objective. I've lost count of how many thousands of cruise missiles and precision munitions and Iskanders they have fired on Ukraine. Ukraine is still standing up. They have taken massive losses, especially the ground forces, maneuver units. I think the airborne forces seem to have been bearing the brunt of it, naval infantry, and also the ordinary motor rifle formations. And they clearly have a problem to augment forces to enable a decisive outcome. Lawrence Friedman wrote a good piece recently and comparing the war to two exhausted boxers that are basically leaning onto each other and exchanging undecisive weak blows because they're also exhausted. The one who can augment the forces with both quantity and quality has a good chance of winning this, but both sides seems to be, I think I can see contours of efforts to do that, but it's very, very difficult for them to do that. Especially Russia has recruitment and replacement problems that are quite severe. Well, I don't know the numbers, but if you're recruiting in churches, in prisons, etc., and you train people for 5-6 days and then send them off to the front, and even people at my tender age are eligible to go and serve in frontline units. It's not a sign that everything is fine. There's a similar story on the equipment side, that they have lost a lot of equipment. There are various websites you can look at and sort of making assessments. But it's obviously hard to repair and replace, and they're digging things deep out of stores. I think it was already in June I heard messages about T-62s being brought to the front. And that's a tank that is far older than I am. What we mustn't forget is that some part of Russia's armed forces are actually unused, are still there, and that's especially the Navy, except the Black Sea Fleet, perhaps the Caspian Flotilla. But the Russian Navy in the Far East, I would guess, and Northern Fleet, and for us then, crucial, the Baltic Fleet, are reasonably intact, except the naval infantry, because they're all down in Ukraine fighting, and I think all the landing ships are in the Black Sea as well. But they haven't been used. Nuclear forces are still intact. And thank heavens they haven't been used yet. I think that the biggest military reason for not using them is it's not very clear what they would achieve. If you cannot answer with what, on what, for what, then what questions about nuclear weapons, don't use them. The only thing that Russia seems to be quite happy with right now is that the war stays in Ukraine. If they use nuclear weapons, this is suddenly an issue for mankind and not just Ukraine, Russia. So that might be a reason for that the war can spread, and I don't think they want that. Having said all this, an observation I make, if all these problems, recruitment, equipment, logistics, command and control, morale, blah, blah, what have you not, the Russian operation still goes on. I just wonder how the Swedish army would have fared if we had been fighting in these preconditions, with bad political guidance, bad logistics, bad all this, bad all that. So the Russian operation is still ongoing. I can't really say why, but I just make that observation because there's been a choir singing since the spring, basically, God, the Russians are so useless because they're useless because they're useless. And I think that's very, very, very dangerous again into that. Yes, they have underperformed. Yes, they've had problems, but don't write them off. Don't count them out. Next slide, please. Right, how right were we about Russian military capability? This is just some very brief points where I take a factor, sort of summarize what we did in 2019 and then what we have seen so far in 2022, and my own verdict, how good was this? And the factors we looked: time, troop, terrain, Swedish Army Classic. I was always told if you're going to say something what's going on in the field, you have to at least have these three parts into what you say: when, where, and how much, and what. So the time to go to war, as I showed you on the slide, 1 to 2 months, based on what we've seen on major strategic exercises every year. You can depend on how you count, but in 2022 and the Ukraine war was 4 to 12 months. 4 months because there was reports about forces being amassed in, I think, November, December. But you could also say that the big Russian evaluation exercise with 300,000 soldiers near Ukraine in April was in a sense a precursor to this, and other measures. So depending how you think, but it was not as fast as we thought. So we have to rethink that one now based on the empirical evidence we have. Terrain. Well, you saw all my maps, all my distances and all that. Terrain matters. And that's for us, well, that was an important point to make in our analysis, because I read a lot of military analysis and capability assessments that do not factor in terrain. So yes, that was a point we made. And as I mentioned very briefly, we said that this railway, Russian gauge railway network plus 300 kilometers, that's how far the Russian force could fight, ground force could fight. Soviet Union had Russian gauge railways, right? And we got that bit reasonably well, because you could see that the end of the railway network on the border with Russia, because they haven't been able to drive many trains into Ukraine, because I think there was sabotage on railway lines very early. But they've been able to get some 300 kilometers, if you look at the maps, give or take. And also when it comes to terrain factor, yes, it matters. Ukraine is big. That's another country that is big. I talked about saying Russia is big, and you can see it in your iPhone, and it looks very small. But you can also see Ukraine maps in your iPhone, and you forget it's 1,300 kilometers east-west. When you see all these arrows being drawn across maps of Ukraine, I always think, well, there's some poor bastard who has to carry the rucksack all that way and drive the truck, etc., etc. So Ukraine is big, and that's a factor we have to remember. But the terrain bit, I'm quite pleased with how we got that one done. But I'm happy to accept any additional comments on it. Troops then. You remember my map, 5 groups of forces, joint ground forces centric, air and naval support, etc., etc., with up to 130,000 in each. Well, I think we saw 3 to 4 groups of forces, at least at the beginning. The question is how joint they were, because there seemed to be very much coordination issues between services that were not really impressive. And also the force was much smaller. And I based this on the American assessment of up to some 200,000 soldiers, including Rosgvardia interior troops. That's about half the force I thought they would amass for this. So it was okay when it looks structure, but I'm not pleased with how we got the numbers. So we have to rethink that one. That's going to be the big issue now with manning, I think. I have a colleague who's writing a report on that. Then we look very briefly at the various services. If you look at exercises, the ground forces have had plenty of time and opportunity to train combined arms in the past decade. And when they actually go to war, they seem to be pretty unsure of what they're doing. It probably sort of differs from various parts of the operation, but it was very clear that combined arms, making sure you have reconnaissance ahead so you don't drive into ambushes, that you have your fire support, your engineers, etc., to enable the maneuver and make sure the logistics is in time. That apparently didn't happen. Air Force, well, we thought they would be sort of doing air defense for an operation and ground attack to support advancing ground forces. Yeah, they have to some extent, but it's amazing to see how well Ukraine's Air Force and air defense has survived. They took a lot of hits at the very beginning, but what survived has been good enough to make sure the Russians don't rule the sky and own the sky. So they're forcing the Russian aircraft to fly very low or very high. Navy then, in the operations that we envisaged before the war, they were sort of the perimeter defense at sea for an operation across the continent, for example, where they could help open a new operational direction with the sort of landing amphibious forces. We haven't seen that at all in the war in Ukraine, especially no landing of naval forces, or amphibious forces, sorry. And they've been basically doing a sea blockade operation of Ukraine, and being platforms to fire cruise missiles, etc., into Ukraine. And there was some fighting about the Snake Island, etc., etc. That they've apparently given up on that one now. I know the wheat trade is actually ongoing. But anyway, in the way we assess it and analyze it, we need to be better than we were now when we have the empirical evidence, because the forces haven't performed that well as we thought. Again, I think we overestimated them. And all the problems we talked, sort of, that's been all over the press since spring, command control, logistics, morale, etc. We just said we cannot. They're very case specific in each war, and we looked at general capabilities. So we said in our delimitations, basically, we don't deal with this. We can't do it. So to the side. Now, when we see the war is very real, this is happening, and it affects the operation and the outcome very, very strongly. We have to rethink how we approach that one. Next slide, please, Jim. Right, so given that the war is still ongoing, I have started to think, how is it actually possible to do what I tried to do in 2019? How do I model or foresee things like war? We describe general capabilities, but war are always specific cases, and they're extremely complex operations. And how do you capture the violent interaction between adversary forces in an analysis of capability? Well, you can war game and all that, but we have to deal with that matter somehow. We also have to look at hidden factors that have come to the surface now. When it comes to the quality of planning, morale, intent, leadership in war, command and control, and crucially corruption. The nature of corruption is that you don't see it. And corruption thrives as long as it is not exposed. And the effects of corruption in the Russian armed forces, nobody saw it as long as it was peace. But then came war. And there were not so many soldiers that we had got money from the Ministry of Finance for. We didn't have as many tanks and as much fuel as we had thought we had ordered because somebody pocketed the difference. So war has in that sense been a brutal examination for the system that's been very, very corrupt. As I mean, a Russian oligarch pointed out, if the whole society is corrupt and rotten, why shouldn't the armed forces be? But they have been very good at painting a glossy picture. And since I don't have evidence of corruption, it's very hard for me to say it's corrupt. And even if I could say it, I can't say how much and how it affects it. But anyway, war is better than I to check that out. I must admit to a certain confirmation bias also. I've looked for things that confirm what I see, and I realize I've been wrong in that. For example, I looked very much on Russian military exercises, and I realized that they don't simulate war fighting capabilities, but it's the best available thing I can see in peacetime. Of course, this war gives a better insight into how the Russian armed forces fight in exercises, but I didn't have that until this year. A final point then is just right now for Europe, we have a strategic window of opportunity to grow forces. So this is more just a methodological or sort of an over point. Because there are still some people that are worried that, oh, if we start increasing our defense spending, we might provoke Russia. So I might be preaching to the angels here, but I don't think there will be a way for Russia to launch another war in Europe with conventional forces in the coming years, at least, which means we have time, 1, 3, 5 years, to start growing our forces and basically create facts. This is what we have. So when the Russians finish this war at some point, we will not sort of be waiting to start growing our forces then. And I think that was about it. And I have talked for far too long, so I look forward to your questions.
All right. Let's everybody raise their hand. You didn't want to go through those other maps, Johan?
No. They're there. I mean, I can use them if we need be, but just take the questions and we'll see what we need.
Okay. Well, I'm going to start. First of all, how have you assessed the Russian army learning lessons in the field? That is, their ability to draw conclusions from what has not worked and then innovate during war, or we're not seeing that?
I think I can't give you any clear cases that I remember out of. Somebody else might have some information, but I can't remember on the top of my head. The thing is, war is a brutal learner. So I suppose if you don't change, you die. So you have pretty strong incentives to change, and I think they're not stupid. So I think forces in the field can learn, but on the other hand, you're also stuck in your culture, with your structure, with your equipment. So I mean, if your armor gives weak protection against Western anti-tank weapons, there's not much you can do about it, except for not going or just staying in cover all the time. So my short answer is I don't know, but I assume they at least do something, if nothing else, on very individual and unit level.
All right, Alex.
All right. Thank you, Johan, for, again, very interesting starting point. But yeah, let me start first with, have you read the Rusi article on that talks about industrial production, military industrial production in, Europe, well, in the West as opposed to Russia, and argues that the West is not prepared for the kind of, high intensity warfare that, pointing out, the reports about the Russians using, 60, 70,000 artillery rounds a day. Do you agree with those assessments, and that, the Russians are basically prepared for, at least in terms of production, for maintaining this war for, I think the Ukraine said for a year at least. So your thoughts on that?
Yes, I haven't read that Rusi article, but they usually produce good stuff. So I mean, what I think that I have seen and so I have tried to convey for a few years is that Russia is preparing for large-scale war, high-intensity war fighting. And we try to be, over the years, more and more specific with what we actually mean with that. What I now sort of went through very quickly is something that is actually much more elaborate in our report. But it's because I think that there's been an image that military operations, oh, that's something you do in Afghanistan when you chase people with big beards in the mountains. And we've forgotten all about the Fulda Gap. And now the Russians probably realized some 10 years ago, look, the Westerners are all over Afghanistan, but they've forgotten all of this. And few people in the West know that already in 2012, when they launched the new organization, it was still very much a Soviet army with artillery and armor and all that. And also because that is what they had. They cannot change everything at once. So if you want some kind of military power, use what you have. And this is what they've done. And it's also to look at their defense industry over the past decade. Yes, they have all these fashionable Wunderwaffen doing this, doing that, but the bulk, the quantity of what has come out of the defense industry has been modernizing old Soviet equipment, especially in the ground forces, because quantity becomes a quality in itself. So you're absolutely right. Russia has been preparing for this type of war for a long time. Then I think I've seen this assessment on how many millions of rounds they have and what they can run out of and so on. Yeah, you can start making those assessments, but there are so many caveats and reservations, and there's also presuming that everything gets to the front in time, etc. And these assessments do not capture the interactivity. But yes, Russia has long prepared for the high-intensity warfare that is now waging. The question is, why is it doing it so poorly?
All right,
so I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. The other question I asked, and a lot of other people. I've read and seen some evidence that the Ukrainian fortification, they've been preparing, in the Donbass particularly, to fight for 8 years, and I've seen arguments that it's the most heavily fortified area essentially in the entire world at this point. Density of trenches and prepared positions. They clearly prepared cities like Mariupol and Lysychansk and presumably Slavyansk and so on also. So how does that change your assessment of how the Russians are doing? How to overcome those kinds of fortifications? Yeah,
I think that might have explained why the Russians have problems in actually moving very much westwards in especially in Donetsk. In Luhansk they have. I don't know the details of that old operation. I'm not sure whether I cannot compare to how fortified it is compared, for example, to the inter-Korean border. But it's definitely heavily fortified. But the thing is, as soon as the ground maneuver of the war bypasses these fortifications, then they matter less. So if the Russians have moved west, then they don't matter. But they will matter when the war goes the other way. If the Ukrainians want to push the Russians out, when they go on the offensive, these fortifications might be useful for the Russians for the defensive battles. That will be depending on each local situation. But the whole thing now talking about Ukrainian offensive, etc., yes, where are the forces for it? Where's the equipment for it? But also, how will it be when the Ukrainians go on the offensive? They've been very successful at doing defensive operations and various delaying actions and so on. But going on the offensive is much harder, and that's also switching mode of operation is very tricky. And I think that might be what is ongoing right now, but that's is taking a lot of time, and rightly so, I would say.
Okay, let me get to Aaron.
Yeah.
Aaron, go on. Unmute Aaron.
Yep.
Great talk. Thank you very much. I'm wondering in your methodology, in your analysis, how much you're going to take into consideration size of state and force ratios, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of discussion in the last 6 months about the fact that basically Ukraine's the same size as Afghanistan, 40% larger than Iraq, and the equivalence, to believe that in the modern world, large states can just roll over a small state or a medium-sized state or a decent-sized state. But modern armies, modern life precludes the fact to have the kind of force ratios to be able to roll over, hold, and then ultimately dominate states. And we've seen it whether it's the U.S. in Iraq or Afghanistan or other state actors. And I'm just wondering if that's something that's going to enter into your analysis going forward, or if that's something that's out of scope. Because I just find that that's almost primordial to every other discussion. Is if somebody's asking to eat a big whale, it doesn't matter how sharp their teeth are, or how hungry they are, etc. It's the size of the whale that does matter.
But as the Russians say,
Ahab found out.
Yeah. Okay, and the Russians say that you can eat an elephant if you cut it in very small pieces.
True.
But then it's basically saying that things take time, and I think that actually might be Russian approach to this war. For us, it's always a failure because they haven't won in 6 months. They might say, yeah, this might take 10 years. And then it's our perspective that is wrong. But I think your point is good, and I've had something similar myself about basically the utility of military power when you actually employ it. I mean, I'm surprised because the Russians were gloating so much when the US pulled out of Afghanistan and Iraq. Oh, look at them, bad. Oh, they had all these problems. Why all the things they got wrong and so on. And then 6 months later, they sort of embark on something absolutely outrageously mad. Obviously not doing their homework properly, obviously being driven by political delusions, etc., etc. And my point is, as my philosophical point more, is that never go on the offensive. So basically, don't attack another country. If you have to defend yourself like hell. So you need to be able to fight. No question about that. But having this, I have to shape the world with military force in order to get an outcome that is different from what it is today. If that is your mindset as a great power, I hope the Chinese are watching this and realizing, perhaps it's not a good idea to attack Taiwan. But more specifically, force ratios, etc., that is one approach you can have. And the Russians have a pretty elaborate sort of discussion on the correlation of forces and means, or whatever you call it. So we could that. We haven't really thought about exactly how we're going to proceed because we're really basically still shell-shocked from what is happening. And so when we write the next 10-year capability assessment, probably going to do that in 2024 or later even. We'll basically see what we can factor in. So we are basically at the stage we say, yeah, we realize that what we did was good in many ways, but also has some serious flaws. What do we do about it? So your point about force ratios is a good one, and I will actually take that with me. I made a little note here about that. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Well, you can come around again. Let me get to Frank. Frank.
Yeah, hi. My question is, there is a perception, at least I have it, that the combined arms structure is actually rather fragile because, you need many multipliers, and you need SIGINT, you need jammers, you need air defense, you need so many assets to make it possible to do either defense or offense.
Yes.
The problem is, from the Russian point of view, is that they're being overmatched in so many areas. HARM, HIMARS, Harpoons, and the United States has only spent about 10 billion on these weapons. And this has basically stopped them cold. I mean, you can't really argue that they're doing really breakthroughs anywhere. And so, my question is that if we have this capability, we, the United States in particular, it's all very well for European countries like Britain to say, oh, we need to give the Ukrainians as much as they can, which isn't particularly much, right, compared to what the United States could do. And so, we're protracting this war. And that's the problem. If we protract the war, then, we can assess the Russians as what they are right now, and we can start doing calculations as what they possibly might have. But the longer we do it, after all, the Russians are doing war games with the Chinese right now. So if the Chinese feel that they need to somehow bolster the Russians, I mean, this idea of dribbling in things, and even though it helps the Ukrainians, it seems to me that the strategic guidance at this end is wrong. I mean, when I say this end, the American guidance is wrong. It needs to understand that if you're going to alter this thing, you need to do it now. And that I've got another question too.
Okay. All right. So but you basically it's about the size, the quality, and crucially the timing of equipment to Ukraine, and that cannot be fast enough. On the other hand, it mustn't be faster than it can actually be absorbed into units. And my hunch, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but my hunch that this is Lend-Lease 1 and then a second one coming, that seemed to be more structured than just pouring in javelins or howitzers or old tanks into Ukraine, because with each system comes its own logistics requirements and maintenance requirements and spare parts requirements, because things break in war. If things are becoming a bit more structured and systematic, I mean, we all did that at the very beginning because something had to be done, but improvisation is always suboptimal. So I think that what Ukraine has an advantage, it has more people who want to fight. What Ukraine can have an advantage in is that it has perhaps a slightly more time to train these people than the Russians have. But I can see that both sides are basically, nothing happens at the front lines. They haven't moved significantly since April, late April, May. Russians are apparently rotating units back into Russia to replenish them. And I have a feeling that some of the equipment that we send to Ukraine from the West actually ends up at the front, but not all. I heard a figure that roughly 1/3 ends up at the front. What happens to the other 2/3? Is it gone in corruption? Well, Ukraine is corrupt, but perhaps not that corrupt. Let's say that 1/3 goes away in corruption. But then another third might be held back in actually building the force that can actually make a difference. You create not just a unit, but a force that can fight with all these different parts, as you pointed out. Because you're just sending another tank company or another battery of HIMARS, or this won't make a structural difference. It will add some firepower here and there. But these are things I don't see. I cannot, so I only speculate now. The Ukrainians seems to be about building something more structured, because they know they cannot say we're going to have a big autumn offensive with the forces they just have in the field at the moment. They are worn out. Something must be happening elsewhere if that is true. The same with the Russians. They feed all these volunteers and whatever they call them into the sort of piecemeal into battle, but that won't make a big difference. I think the units that are rotating back to Russia, perhaps being sort of replenished in a more structured way, will come back and try to make a difference later on. But this is just pure speculation. But your point about combined arms being fragile is a good one. But it's just, sometimes I wonder what is it sort of the maximum complexity you can deal with in terms of interdependent but independently moving parts in an operation like this. Because getting it all together, it's very difficult. Sorry, and your second question.
Yeah, go on, Frank.
Well, I didn't have a second question, but I was to play on that. It's the time factor is I don't think appreciated enough. You know, I'm saying that, okay, it's all very well to say that they can't absorb it. Well, the point is that they have to absorb it, because if they don't do it in a timely manner, then it is possible that China may come to the assistance of Russia, especially in terms of semiconductor chips, in terms of sophisticated. I mean, after all, you know, we could argue that they're running out of 152 and 122 ammunition, right? But, well, China's got so much of that, they probably could go on ad nauseum, right? So,
I'm not so sure that the Chinese love of Russia is that great. I mean, there is, on the surface, everything is kiss and hugs and great, you know, but the Chinese companies have pulled out of Russia. They are not eager to attract Western sanctions. So it's not clear across the board that the Chinese are behind the Russians. They might be doing fishy things with the military stuff, but even if they send ammunition for artillery, it has to travel probably by train then all the way. But it will get there eventually. The question is, will another couple of 100,000 artillery rounds make a difference when the millions they have already fired obviously have not had a decisive impact on the war? So the question is, if Russia is doing more of the same that hasn't worked because that's the ammunition they get, that's what they can do, is it what they should do to win the war? I mean, as long as, for me, basically in terms of military functions, if the Russian maneuver doesn't get stronger, they can not get very much further. There's the fire support, etc., and the sustainability. Fire support works, but the sustainability is low in general. But it's a maneuver that enables you to actually either take ground, hold it, or kick the other one out. And they're both. Ukraine seems to have a more sort of potential in that. Yeah, I'll stop there and then have some more questions. But good points. Thanks so much, Frank.
Yeah, I just want to comment quickly before I bring Ted on. Most of the comments I get back from people who've been over into Ukraine training
Yep.
Territorial troops for several weeks. I know a few guys who went over there and did that. Is that they're training these guys, and then of course they get deployed into the Donbass, into high intensity conventional fighting. And if we read these discussions about whether we can draw any accuracy from them or not, about the poor training for the Russian troops, they're being sent into high intensity conventional fighting with only 2 to 3 weeks training, which we know is not adequate. And also the other question comes in about this counterattack force. I remember coming across a couple of weeks ago some quote where they said they were preparing 10 brigades in the rear for possible use in this. And we really don't know what the hell's going on. But let me bring Ted on. Ted, go on. Ted. You have to unmute, Ted.
I did. Thank you very much. Yeah. If I could, I want to thank you, first of all, for being making this extraordinary effort to examine your own analysis and take it apart and then begin again. This is a rare thing that happens in academic analysis. It may have, hopefully it happens a great deal in strategic analysis inside militaries and defense agencies. Right? I have two simple questions. Well, not simple, but two questions. One is stepping back in history before the events began. We remember that Putin sent troops into Kazakhstan, and he also sent troops into Belarus to support the dictators when they lost their elections or didn't do well in the elections. Did you take into account any way that those were rehearsals for the use of troops outside of the Russian Federation? That's one question. So I move to the next one, or would you like to try to take that one on first?
I can take that one pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I remember I was very impressed with the Kazakhstan operation because I think they were moving within 6 or 8 hours after the news broke. Okay, yes, they probably have some pre-warning, perhaps a day or two, but nevertheless, they responded damn quickly. And also, I saw an unofficial list of the places where they went in Kazakhstan and all the sort of key buildings they went to, etc. So it was clearly not law and order, but it was basically grabbing the brain and nervous system of Kazakh government.
Yeah.
So and the thing is, was that a rehearsal? No, but it was actually using a tool they have developed for many years. Basically, the airborne forces. It was VDV that did it once again.
That's right. Yeah.
But I think in Belarus, it was actually Rosgvardia troops, the interior troops. But I must say I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. No, that was amazing because I follow the Far East and Japan is my area of Far East, and so there are lots of,
all right. Yeah.
I could ask about China, but I'm not going to ask about China now.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the Air Force, extraordinary, the invisibility of the Russian Air Force in the skies over Ukraine. Well, they're not invisible. Of course, they're there, and they've done tremendous damage with their special weapons, particularly cruise missiles and such. But I wondered if you have any reason, besides the fact that the Ukrainians have anti-aircraft weapons, is it their fear of loss? Is it? Do they have a strategic fear of loss? Can they not replace the pilots or the system? Is there, because you lose airplanes when you attack on the ground, and that's anticipated. But they have tremendous strategic response. Results can come from it. So it's a question of doctrine. Then, do they think they can't work? It doesn't work, which is good for us to know, or do they think that they can't afford to lose it? Thank you.
I think the bit blurry answer is a bit of everything, but I think they fear the loss of it because it became much more costly than they thought, and I think the various manpads etc. that have been delivered have actually made a difference. If perhaps not taking out so many aircrafts and helicopters, but actually forcing them to change their behavior. But it's been amazing that the Russian air superiority on paper. I mean, reference the previous question with force ratios. I mean, on paper, the Russian Air Force should have mauled the Ukrainian Air Force in days. It didn't, and I cannot say why, but I think we have overrated. I mean, there was a good piece from, I think it was from Rusi. We could have been Chatham House, or I think early March. It was very early in the conflict, pointing out where the hell is the Russian Air Force. And I think the author then pointed out that we have actually never seen the Russians flying complex air operations over time against an enemy that actually shoots back. because Syria operation, they were flying at altitudes so that whatever air defense was on the ground could never reach them. And there it didn't really matter if they had hit a camel or two extra. They didn't really care. And here, when it's much more, you have much more mobile targets, you have harder targets, you have targets that shoot back, and you need to coordinate with, crucially, you need to coordinate with your own advancing ground forces. You didn't do that in the same way in Syria, as far as I understand, especially not on the scale that's been required here. So obviously, they seem to be operating somewhat separately, and that's why I talked about poor inter-service coordination. But these things are complex to carry out at the best of times. But I basically have always assumed, and this is again a methodological error, that if you have aircraft and ground forces in an exercise, you have had some kind of coordination. You have learned something that day, and if you do that over and over again, you should actually get reasonably good at it. But I must have been wrong, because I cannot make that type of assumption. Basically, just because they have things on an exercise doesn't mean it works well.
Thank you.
I talked to an American expert who said, but US exercises, they actually always push, especially staffs and commanders, into making mistakes, and actually to make the system break down, to see where's the limit and what do you do when you reach the limit. And the same person pointed out that the further east you go with NATO allies, the more exercises are actually parade that must be successful and look good.
Yeah.
And if you go further into Russia, that's probably the case too. And when I actually look what I see from Russian military exercises, there's a lot of brouhaha about now this battalion did this and now that battery fired there. And at the end of these strategic exercises, there's this massive live fire party against a square kilometer where you have artillery, 8 or 9 battalions, you have cruise missiles, you have frontal aviation, what have you not. And it go boom. Is that military capability? No, it's the ability to deliver munitions to a square kilometer where nobody shoots back. So, I mean, again, for me, the big thing is war is interactive.
Yeah.
And even if you only have your own chess pieces on and the white pieces on your side of the chessboard, that is complex in itself.
Pieces come back. You see, one of the keys of the Japanese chess versus Western chess is they don't die; they come back off the board.
I see. All right, yeah.
And so, no, I think that's what I'm watching. I'm actually thinking about that as a model for what this war is. The Russian pieces have all been beaten up, but they take them back home, and you try to fix them up and use them again.
Yeah,
it's a possibility. Yeah. But thank you very much. That's very helpful to me. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Yeah, and Ted raises a really interesting question, because we all have been beset by the literature since the Gulf War about how the various militaries of the world have been trying to understand the use of the integration of combined arms by the Americans in carrying out the offensives in 91 and then, of course, in 2003. And it brings up to me the kind of insights that I learned from Lieutenant General Dan Bolger when he wrote his book about the NTC. But it just raises questions about how much these lessons have really been learned. Gary, go on, man. Go on, Gary.
Hey, thanks. Well, Ted, you asked one of my questions probably better than I would have, so thank you for that. I find it interesting that you mentioned that modern military analysts often neglect the dimensions of terrain or geography, terrain written larger, because that's kind of one of my pet peeves when it comes to military historians. They give lip service to it. They mention it when it supports their thesis, but it just goes out the window when it doesn't. So I'm surprised maybe I'm not surprised that that's still a phenomenon. So let me put you on the spot and ask you, test your powers of prognostication as you've sort of, done your mea culpa and your partial mea culpa for what you've done in the past or what your team has done. It seems to me that either you have this 10 brigades, using this 1/3 of the equipment being sent there, being trained up in the background somehow. And I think optimistically, perhaps they have a window next month before, the rains come and the winter comes and all that. But either you have that's going to somehow Deus ex machina appear next month, or you've got a long war on your hands, at least until next spring and maybe longer, because I think something you mentioned about, yes, the point you made about the Russians, failing in this way and that way, but they're still fighting, which I think has the geographic dimension to it as well. I mean, you have a huge country, you have a certain self, concept. And on the other hand, you have the Ukrainians who are fighting for their own homeland, and we've seen how, as Aaron, mentions, how these so-called smaller countries in the second half of the 20th century have taken on much bigger powers and prevailed just because they keep fighting. They don't give up. So, do you see those as being the two kind of possibilities? I mean, what are your predictions for the future, if you're willing to venture, crazily enough?
Yeah, I will use my powers of speculation and basically say, well, I think it boils down to go back to Clausewitz. It's a fight between wills. The willpower matters. I mean, if you just look at firepower and force ratios, and the US and Vietnam, Russia and Afghanistan, the US and the West in Afghanistan, that doesn't give the whole story. And even if you fight a brilliant military operation and sort of basically shoot your enemy to bits, then what happens with the war and the wider political aims if you don't have an idea what to do next? And I think what we're into now is basically a long war of attrition that might sort of have some moments of maneuver or movement later on, but unless I start seeing these forces that everybody talk about, this offensive for this and that, yeah, fine, but show me the list, show me where they are, and then I can start assessing it. But I think it boils down to who wants to do this the most. Then we have all these factors that are outside the actual war theater that nevertheless affects the war. I mean, what will the Russian population say? Because I mean, the war in Afghanistan, I think, was a contributing factor to the end of to the demise of the Soviet Union, but it took 10 years. It might be shorter now, it might be longer. One thing that has surprised me this summer is I've seen a thing I never thought I would see in Russia is the recruitment of national battalions and national ethnicity-based units. That might be great for mobilizing people for the war, but in a multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-language empire as Russia, sowing these military seeds in Ukraine could be reaping armed movement storm within Russia later on. Because why was Stalin so obsessed with the nationality issue? Because he knew it was an explosive issue. And having national movements, the Chechens show you what can happen if you have an ethnically based armed movement within Russia. You can have 5 or 6 or 8 Chechnyas in 10 years' time because you start actually allowing this to happen. Purely speculation in my term. But we could actually have either country collapsing economically, politically, because they can't take the strain of the attrition war over time. We don't know that. So, I mean, and I must admit, I was surprised that this war actually happened. I thought it was coercive diplomacy all along, and it was actually quite brilliantly played by the Russians until they were so just stupid enough to launch this bloody war. Because then, imagine February 23rd, after decades of the world basically neglecting Russian views, all of the world was waiting for the next statement from the Kremlin. What are you going to say next? What are you going to say next? We all really listened to the Russians and interpreted every word they said about recognizing the Donbass Republic, blah, blah, etc. And then they waste this moment. And then they had the economy, less sanctions, armed forces intact, and they still had a decisive influence on Ukraine because Ukraine wasn't going anywhere near NATO or EU whilst the Donbass war was ongoing. And they had Crimea. And suddenly, all of that is actually in play. But it's going to take time. I mean, all comments I hear and all factors I can see and assess is that it's going to be a long war, bar from the facts I don't see. But all I can see tells me it's going to be a long war. We'll see if we sit here in a year's time. We'll have a follow-up on August 20th, 2023 and see what happens then.
Yeah, yeah. I hope you're wrong, but I feel the same way. So thank you.
God, I've hoped so many times. I've hoped I've been wrong over this past 6 months, and I just say, yeah, no.
I think you're probably right, because there is the will factor is there on both sides, and I just don't see that evaporating. And I know Frank is. I've been, I'm agree with Frank. I've been critical with the administration, the way they've kind of dribbled in, material support, but I mean, I just feel like in the long run, it's going to be, there isn't going to be even whatever happens in the elections in November and stuff. I just don't see the United States cutting off support and other Western countries for Ukraine in a decisive way any time for a long period of time. So I just see this going on and on, tragically.
A small two-finger on that one. There has been a debate here in Europe, and people observing that over the summer, military aid to Ukraine deliveries have been far less. On the other hand, I have seen political initiatives to increase coordination between donors. So you actually get things that work, and you don't just deliver a lot of problems in terms of logistics and maintenance. In the Ukrainians certainly don't need additional problems. So these things are complex, and you can do it quickly, and you might get it right, but you probably get it wrong, or you take some time to make sure it gets more right than wrong. But it's always, I suppose, it's a conflicting interest: is getting it right or in time?
Yeah, I guess it's hard to say, but
I think that
maybe
the
it's getting
overall
smarter.
process, which many Russian observers have noted. Yeah, but I think what the overall process, though, is that this war has within 6 months taken Ukraine out of the Russian defense industry orbit big time, because basically Ukraine has no Soviet era equipment left that works, and everything that is decisive and works and that they want to use and will use in the future is from the West, which means that a big client of Russian defense industry of sort of all these things they could do together is just gone. And it's also proven the problems with a lot of Russian equipment. So in a sense, this has been a marketing bonanza for Western equipment. And just to say that I know there's been problem with the various debates in the US about what should give and not. But from my perspective, where I sit and when I listen to many voices, is that the US has been crucial in enabling Ukraine's survival. Without what has been given from the US, it would have, in my world, probably collapsed by now. So even if it's too little, even if it feels a bit too late, it could have been far worse than it is. So in that sense, the glass is approaching half full anyway, but it's not done yet. I mean, it's not by no means finished. And I think that in a sense, this is an ideal. There are some advantages for the West writ large in this situation, because this is a war we do not want to fight. We are not prepared. I mean, my son is doing his national service in a Swedish artillery regiment at the moment. Do I want him to go and fight in Ukraine? Hell no. But if Russia comes here, yes, then both him and I have to go. But now the Ukrainians will do it for us if we give them the stuff. Mm-hmm. And they apparently still have the will left that is so crucial. We just identify that. And I'm not sure about the Russian will. Because I think it is, I don't follow this, but I got this from a colleague, that Navalny's team is actually interviewing Russians, and the question is, are you a patriot? Yes, I'm a patriot. People say on camera, do you support the war? Yes, I support the war. Oh, do you want to sign the contract and join the fighting? No, sorry, I'm too old. No, but you're only 60, you can go, no problem. So when push comes to shove, how big is the support really? And also, if you stand up and say, I'm against the war in Russia, you're put to prison, which means that you actually don't know how many people actually support the war. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I see a pretty unanimous, I mean, at least the Ukrainian propaganda op is that basically everyone is behind it in Ukraine. I have a sense that there is much more sort of rallying around the flag there.
Okay, Gary, and I also, Bob and Brandon, don't be shy. You can certainly jump in. Frank, go on, Frank.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not going to let you off the hook there with the, I'm going to have to continue with what Gary's saying. And there is a certain calculus that is inescapable, and that is that if they're going to do a counteroffensive these, as I call them, overmatch weapons, particularly HIMARS, there is actually only a limited production line, actually only a limited supply of this stuff. If you put it in driblets, it's expended in driblets, and you may get results that I think are amazing at the moment, like ammunition dumps going up, etc. But if you're going to use it in a counteroffensive, I mean, it's the same concept as a blitzkrieg. If you do it right, your casualties are low. If you get it wrong, it can be the Somme. So it's like the Somme versus Operation Michael.
Yeah.
You know, if you get it right, the problem in getting it right is that in the United States, we do not have a general staff that can handle it, because we've been dealing with, you know, ISIS and dudes in the top floor of a building and in devoting entire battalions to take that guy out. You know, this is a completely different thing. And the question is, you know, where is the expertise? Is it in Ukraine? Probably not. You know, this is a vicious cycle that they absolutely have to do this now. They really absolutely have to do it now, because if they don't do it now, there is no way this can be a long-term thing for Ukraine. Both sides are facing domestic implosion in some point. Hopefully, you know, it's a domestic implosion in Russia, and, you know, there's a regime change. There could be one here, by the way. But there seems, I don't think it's realized that these weapon systems, whether it's, you know, even using as special forces, the other side can extemporize. They can figure out how to deal with it. You know, they're getting great results with special forces. Well, guess what? There could be a day where they're all rounded up and killed. Boom. And that can happen. And then where are you? This stuff has to be used once. It's a one-time only deal.
Yeah, but I think to sort of just continue your argument, you're making great points. I mean, but the ability to actually carry out an offensive operational level operation, combined arms, support from other services and all that. I mean, people train for decades to be able to do that. I'm very sorry to hear that you have no one in the US who's able to do this, because I thought that you guys were the ones who are able to do it, because we certainly don't, because we followed you to Afghanistan and we've become very good at chasing people in the mountains. But, you know, we're really slowly waking up to combined arms back home here. And how do we actually do it? And how did I mean, suddenly I have a certain value as a very old reserve officer, because I'm actually a Cold War product. So I remember being in the, makes two of us, right? But, you know, actually being in a combined arms exercise, where you have being in the staff, the engineers, having everyone having these discussions on how to do things. And I said, I've actually seen it. And now it is, you can see young lieutenants and captains, it takes time for them to get it. They're really skilled at what they learned in Afghanistan and so on. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but they just don't have the experience. On the other hand, I mean, you have to adapt in war, just do or die. So, I mean, I think that perhaps you shouldn't underestimate that the Ukrainians have learned a thing or two over the years they have fought, because they fought Russia for 8 years now. Mainly defensive, mainly sort of position battles and all that. Nevertheless, they have. But you're taking out pointing out all these great issues. Blitzkrieg could be successful, it could be the Somme. We simply don't know. And I can agree with all the factors, but I think that what we have to say, the Ukrainian offensive might come now at one place. I don't think it's going to go an all-out offensive. It could be probably Kherson Oblast, perhaps the one that is on west of the Dnieper, to keep the Russians on the other side of the river. I would, when I look at the map, it would be great if they could actually attack down toward Berdyansk at the coast, because then they would basically cut off the land bridge to Crimea. But that's a big operation. I'm not sure they can make that. Nevertheless, this might not be the last offensive. Yes, then winter will come with all the mud and the rains and the Rasputitsa, whatever you call it. But then both sides will recuperate. The question on who will use that time best. And the thing is that and here the US is crucial, because US leadership is needed to ensure Western support. The rest of us will tag along. and have all of these initiatives and so on. But if there is not a US leadership on this, I think many European countries would start sort of look the other way and get nervous about things and stop. So yes, there might have been delays in US deliveries, etc. It could be more, yes, of course, but I'm also very happy that there is this support from the United States, and especially the leadership.
All right, Alex, go on, Alex.
Yeah, so let me piggyback on what Frank was asking about with the counteroffensive. In that, we had a statement by, I forget the guy's name, one of Zelensky's main aides, that the counteroffensive is a psychological operation, an information operation. Also, there's been reporting. I saw an article in the Washington Post and another one, I think, in Newsweek, of reporters on the ground saying they saw zero sign of the massing of forces for a counteroffensive there, and also in the existing counteroffensives that the Ukrainians have done already, it's been on a relatively small scale. They've been they haven't put together. I mean, they don't have division organization. They haven't since they've been fighting their war in the Donbass for 8 years, they haven't, I don't think they've been doing any big, large-scale exercises. So I have a question whether they have the ability to do a large-scale counter-offensive, certainly get in a counter, in putting together several brigades into one big fist, as we would say. So I wonder your response.
Given the usual evidence you require to say yes, they have it or not, like big exercises, the actual organization and the manpower and the equipment, the answer is no. On the other hand, the bumblebee doesn't really know it cannot fly, and it does anyway. So perhaps they simply have to do it, even if it's perfect. I thought that was a Swedish phenomenon, that unless maybe we want everything to be high tech, like a Swiss watch, and very perfect and ultra modern, latest technology, then we're happy. But the Russian approach is always old tanks also kill. They go back basically to the nature of war, that is this violent conflict between wills, which means it doesn't have to be so bloody high tech. Now, this is another point where I've been proven wrong, that because I thought that the Russian approach with quantity firepower would actually be a problem for a Western equipped force. But no, that is not the case. Even if you fire 1,000 artillery rounds into a field where nobody is, it doesn't matter. You have to actually find the force. You have to have your targeting, your damage assessment, and that whole cycle working. I thought they would be better at it, but I mean, Russian artillery has made a big damage. Make no mistake, but it hasn't had the decisive effect yet. Again, because I think Ukraine is so big. But I think, to go back to your point, the Ukrainian might not have the luxury to getting it perfect.
Right. Yeah, I wonder if you can tell us about what sources you're using to keep track of. Obviously, there's a lot out there. Yeah. Are there any particular sites you tend to look at? So that we can take a look at them too.
Yeah, I mean, I've made a very deliberate choice here. Because I mean, my day, I have about 16, 18 hours awake every day. And what can I take in? And I think my comparative advantage is that I speak Russian. So I've started to listen to analysts on YouTube that speak Russian to a Russian audience in Russia, but they sit in Riga, Tbilisi, Vilnius. I mean, they're in exile basically, and they're very critical about the Russian propaganda narrative. But I would recommend Conflict Intelligence Team, Ruslan Leviev, if you speak Russian. I think they have a website, but when you listen to them, they're a bit obsessed with each and every explosion and getting it right. But their ambition to get it right, I appreciate. Number two, every now and then, in this midst of all the detail they cover, they have some really good information pieces. So it's worth listening to every day. And I think they come across as intellectually honest. And they basically say, yeah, but if you find other evidence, call us or send us an email, and we'll correct it. We love standing corrected, because they sort of see this more as a discussion that we get it right together in a sense. There is a Ukrainian former general staff officer, Alex Zhdanov, who has daily roundups. speaking in Russian. He is very much a sort of a Soviet staff officer. He goes through follows a protocol. He doesn't use maps, which is a problem. So if you don't know where this village is or the direction he's talking about, then it could be confusing. But he has a military professional's eye on things, and he has a very good question and answer session. Excuse me, I will just need to. Then there's another guy called Yuri Fyodorov, who is appearing at the daily called Breakfast Show. If you listen to Echo Moskvy, the radio station before the war, the Echo, Moscow Echo, they now continue in exile. They were closed down in March, and then they continue in exile. They have a military analyst that talks about things as well. So I basically try to listen to Russian voices that speak critically about the Russian narrative of the war. And I think that's quite interesting. I mean, there are many good analysts in the West. Mike Hoffman, the people at Rand, etc. So there's plenty of people writing things, and I mean, and I think that now when serious publications like New York Times, Washington Post start writing long things about the war and go into detail with good journalists, I think they get a lot of things right as well. And then there is, you know, I try to avoid Twitter because I get confused.
Right. All right. Well, and it'd be great if you could send us those links, Johan, so we could look at them.
Sure.
Brandon, go on, Brandon.
Air power. My question is basically, do you have any window into or insight, or have you been hearing any conversations from any of these Russian analysts about what's going on too far behind the lines to be HIMARS or cruise missiles? And any speculation about if that's being supported, how that's being supported, or whether it's somehow organic resistance to the Russian war effort?
You mean what's happening in Crimea more specifically?
Well, it could be certainly there, but also there was an operation the other day that was over 100 kilometers behind the line, and it was literally in Russia.
It was in Belgorod, I think.
Yeah, maybe it was in Belgrade. You're right.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, these issues pop up on a daily basis in these discussions, and I've seen speculate. I mean, there's no firm evidence, or sort of this is it. But what I have. Sorry, is my mic too low?
Better now.
Can you hear me? I get this message and my mic is too low. Okay,
you're fine.
You're good.
Fine.
Okay, good. It could be special forces in combination with kamikaze drones. It could be the Ukrainians used to develop something similar to Iskander. I think it's called the Sapsan or something like that, sort of a surface missile. I'm not sure whether that's operational or not, whether they managed to sort of cobble it together in sort of below the radar. That's something that has been supplied by the West, but not officially. So this speculation or sabotage among Russians in Crimea or Ukrainians in Crimea, all of these speculations exist. I think the one with special forces and killer drones, especially against the aircraft, was probably the case. Then I'm not sure whether you would use kamikaze drones against things like the transformation station for electricity or something like that. I'm not very good at sort of targeting in that sense. But the point with what happened, especially in Crimea, is that the war is back in Crimea. This is where it all started in 2014. Now, and I think that this Russian sense of impunity in Crimea is somewhat gone. So it's more of a psychological effect for the moment. It has, as far as I understand, not yet affected Russia's overall fighting power in the southern operation, sort of in terms of ability to supply and forces and so on. But it's very clear that the targeting was about Russian mobility and sustainability. The functions within an operation, and get the railway slower, get to the ammunition stores, and also the Air Force, which is sort of the fire support bit. But it's so far no decisive difference.
All right, I just want to ask you if we could just basically exhaust the people that have their hands up. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Yes. Yeah,
right.
sure. Go
ahead.
Right.
Let me just throw two things in. First of all, I'd like to get your assessment as to how people in Europe, how people in Sweden are watching the evolution of this domestic problem we have with Mr. Trump. Because as Frank alluded to earlier, that is the regime change. If he gets elected as president again, one could at least see a decisive change in this policy. That's the first question. I just want to get your assessment of that.
Well, it's very easy in a sense that the world, I mean, the West, and I think the world at large, is obsessed with US politics because we know it affects us. Swedish Public Radio has 3 reporters in the US and I think only 1 part-time in Finland, which is a neighboring country of great importance to us. So just to say that everyone follows US politics very closely, and with the Trump, and if Trump is re-elected, I mean, we all fear that there could be a change of policy because, again, US leadership so far has been very, very, very important. And also a very heartfelt thanks from me as personally as a Swede who support our membership in NATO, is that the support and assistance we have, Finland and Sweden has been given by the United States, is very, very important. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the US plays a crucial role, and of course we follow what goes on with the elections. And so, I mean, I get Swedish Public Radio reports about what happens in local elections in Georgia and in Wyoming and et cetera, et cetera. So, yes, we follow it. Then we'll see what happens. That is way beyond us. It's up to you guys.
Right, exactly.
But it is important to us.
Now, secondly, and I'll turn it over to Aaron and Frank, the question of the replacement rates for both sides. Because again, I'm looking as much as you are. You're looking at a lot of the Russian sources. I look at some of them too. I'm looking at the Ukrainian. I'm looking at the Western. And again, who knows what the hell's going on? It just is a confusing mishmash to try to figure it out.
Yeah.
But
no one.
Exactly. But what I'm curious about is your assessment of how the Russian replacement capability has been evolving and their reconstitution. Earlier in the chat, I think Alex posted about the formation of 15 new national BTGs. Alex, you're referring to those are the units that were
16 I've seen reported.
And
yeah.
those are the units. And that's that mobile Johan was talking about, right? Earlier.
Yeah, the national battalions. Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, I'm just curious what you think about what they're actually doing in with the kind of sources you're looking at. What assessments do you have about their ability to replace losses?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's a quantity aspect and a quality aspect to it. In pure numbers, I don't know, and no one actually knows. And I mean, my hunch is that no one actually knows. I am not sure that the Russian general staff actually knows. I am not sure that the Ukrainian general staff actually knows. They might have impressions about how much they have or not. But just, reporting takes time to come up the chain of command. Do you include missings in action or not, or et cetera, et cetera? So it's all this blurry circus. And I think you're absolutely right, because there's been a lot of debate how many people have been killed, which for me is absolutely pointless in a bit of a morbid debate. The point is, how can you replace and augment your forces so you can actually win? And you also have sort of the quantity and quality numbers. Quantity, I have no clue. On the Ukrainian, I actually have no clue. I try to follow Ukraine a bit, but I can't. I'm fully busy with Russia. But on the Russian side, I don't know. But just the nature of the measures they are taking. They are recruiting all these, as I mentioned, prisoners, churches, wherever, getting people 2 or 3 days training in Chechnya, and then off you go. That smacks of desperation. That is not about winning a war. That is about just pumping things into the quagmire somehow. So they can do that, and then they have a big population. And in the Russian military doctrine is Babi Novy Khrajayud. The ladies will give birth to new ones. That's sort of very Soviet approach to things. So I don't think they, but the thing is, here I wonder when they have units rotating back into Russia and sort of reconstituting perhaps on a longer term, so not just in a few days, but perhaps weeks, perhaps months, and then going back. So I I don't think anyone has the exact numbers except Lord Almighty himself, but I certainly don't.
Right, exactly. And just one last comment. We're looking at all these open sources, and all of us can, of course, see how it'd be worthwhile if we were doing our updates at a time when Johan could join us, not at 2 in the morning in Sweden time. But what's interesting is it showed the shift of Russian troops down into the opposite side of the Dnieper River. We've seen in all these open sources 30, 40 battalion tactical groups mounted across that river to deal with whatever is going to happen. But let me bring Aaron in. Aaron, go on.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I just have some follow-ups based on a lot of stuff everyone's been bringing up, which is really the force concentration, structure, training pieces. As a former Cab scout, I spent a dozen years in the Cab, both armored and reconnaissance. The amount of training it takes to, and ultimately you're just, in essence, the forward element, right? You're actually not the fist, right? You're not the concentration of force. But so the amount of training it takes just to be functional in offensive operations is astronomical. And so, I mean, my sense is, and I just don't think there's a hack, a big hack to these things. I mean, can you cut 9 months down to 6 months? Yeah, probably. You can't cut it down to 3 days. And so I'm wondering, because I always see just references to accepting force concentrations and structure, like BTGs, right? We were sort of BTGs were the Kardashians of this whole thing for weeks and months, and at the end of the day, it looks like neither side, especially the Russians, can organize beyond really these BTGs, and no offense, but putting 3-4 BTGs together and calling it a brigade is not a brigade, right? It might be a brigade in terms of how your payroll and your S1 operates, but it's not or your G1 or J1, but it's not a brigade in terms of mobile operations, and forget about a division, etc. So at the end of the day, if the center of gravity in this is either the will on the West, whether Europe, US, and Ukrainians, to both fight, support, and to not get in the way, and on the Russian side is basically their capacity to organize effectively to take massive swaths of Ukrainian terrain and not have massive destruction of Russian forces, then we're sort of stuck not talking about the real problem, right? It's like you have a student who is struggling with math and literacy, and you're talking about buying iPads, and you're talking about buying, sending them to the right camp in the summer, which is fine, but it's not going to change fundamentally what's going on with that student. And I'm just wondering, is that something that you see? Because I just don't see conversations about the fact that after 6 months, the Russians either can't understand that if they can't organize concentration of actual firepower forces, I don't mean bodies, but people who are trained enough to operate together in infantry, cavalry, mechanized formations, you can't actually move if someone's shooting back at you and actually penetrate that and hold that. And I just don't find a big analysis on that. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you just see interior to your community or larger than that.
Thank you. I can see it at times. First of all, the BTGs as the Kardashians of all this, that was really funny. But I see some of that in these Russian conversations, especially from Alex Danov, who's sort of a former Ukrainian general staff officer, because this is something that is very intrinsic to those who have served themselves. It's very hard to explain to civilians, because for them, a soldier is often just a soldier, and a soldier is a soldier, period. But you're absolutely right that you can perhaps go down from 9 to 6 months, but then beyond that, it might be simply too little. The question is if you have the luxury to have the time to train, and I think both sides seem to be short on time, given how they train and how quickly they train people. That might be a cultural heritage, sort of military cultural heritage, because this is what they used to do. just to throw many more people at the problem quickly. Whether it solves the problem or not doesn't matter, because this is simply what you do. And I hope that the training measures now being cobbled together by the UK and other countries, actually training Ukrainian soldiers for a whopping 1 month per soldier, can actually make a difference, because perhaps it's not up to our standards that we have in peacetime. But if all the other soldiers are trained for 3 days or 7 days, then 1 month is suddenly quite a lot. So that might be a difference on sort of a very whimsical quality comparisons like that. But as someone this has been pointed out in our discussions here, is the ability to concentrate forces, both fire support and maneuver forces, infantry and so on,
Right.
with the enablers in terms of engineers, logistics, reconnaissance, etc., the combined arms things. And that's actually one point that this is actually one of the few times I've heard that discussion in such detail as we have had now. The importance of combined arms, because that's been very intrinsic just to military circles to talk about that, because it's a very complex thing. It's very complex to explain to others who just think that military is just a bunch of green men and that's it. So yes, and I think we have to move into these technical discussions. And I think there is now actually an interest in the public to hear about them and listen to them. And that's one of my challenges when I try to explain these things in a simple way in 10 seconds.
All right.
And as soon as you start analyzing that, like we do here, it takes time because there's so many pieces that sort of stick together.
One quick little follow-up.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can go through it.
Just what's your perspective on the staff culture, right? Because the moment you want to get combined maneuver, you want to pull all these pieces together, right? As effective as sergeants are, up to, let's say, E7 in relative forces or chiefs, it's ultimately a command staff culture that actually makes that happen. And if you don't have that, you can have all the PowerPoints and PDFs you want, but they're not really going to actually materialize.
No, I simply don't know. I'm not privy to that information about the Russians. I would love to know. I would love to be sort of visiting a Russian staff, a sort of combined arms army HQ in the field and listen to a staff briefing. That would be my wet dream. Will I get anywhere near that?
Right. Okay, let's bring Frank on. Frank.
Sure.
Okay, this is a kind of sort of leading question, but have you done an analysis on the first stages of the war? Because in that first stage, it's been, de rigueur to mock the Russians as being totally incompetent. But if we compare that effort, particularly around Hotmistel, to, say, Crete in 41, nobody expected the New Zealanders to lose to the paratroopers, on Malmo, and yet it happened. And it's an incredible phenomenon. The Russians came close with their IL-76s. They came close, but they didn't land. And my concern is that there were lessons from the other side, and that Xi Jinping in particular, they're going to be analyzing that to the nth degree to see whether they can actually pull it off correctly in Taiwan. I mean, there was there was supposed to be a fifth column, and this is obviously the decision-making around Putin was SVR and intelligence. They were trying to model on 56, 68, and 79, and they failed, but they didn't fail from what I can see by much. It was some slick actions by the Ukrainians at the very opening stages. Now, they may have had help from us, but it was close. It was really close. And that's my concern, is that, the next time that's employed could be on Taiwan. And I wonder if you've done an analysis of that first stage.
No, not in detail, because I've been busy just trying to follow the overall war. But I remember, I can just go back to my own memories from these days, that things were happening at such a pace. I was learning new place names by the hour in the first 4 or 5 days of the war, compared to now, where I've heard the same place names being mentioned for 2-3 months, where the fighting is basically stuck. I can just say that I'm surprised actually that Ukraine survived. I mean, it's actually good that you bring back the memory now. And yes, it was close. I can agree. But I always fell back to my basic thought about this thing. Ukraine is damn big. How the hell are they going to pull it off? And I've talked a lot about this spring about urban combat. If we agree that this is a fight between wills is actually in the population, and the population lives in cities. If you want to sort of conquer them, you have to go into the cities. And the Russians were loth to do urban combat, and was very clear. And as soon as they were drawn in, they started losing troops at an alarming rate. That's why they just chose to basically fire at Kharkiv and not actually enter it, because it's too big a city to take. And if you remember the Bosnia War in the 90s, Sarajevo was shelled for 4 years, non-stop basically, and it still stood. Coming back to one of the original questions about the utility of military power in general. Then about China, I think that the Chinese, I have 3 Mandarin-speaking colleagues who look at China and sort of what they might think about this. We had that discussion, and they say, A, the Chinese will study this very, very carefully. B, they will say very little. They will support Russia on a sort of overall political way, but be very, very careful not to push any Western red lines too far, because then that can start costs and basically make them part in the conflict. I'm not sure that the Chinese are only pleased with what the Russians are doing. They are upsetting the world order. That might be good for China, but it might also cause a lot of problems. And when it comes to actual military operation, this has shown, as you rightly point out, Frank, that it was close, but it failed. And Russia invading Ukraine with the preconditions that I showed on the map at the beginning is a much easier operation than actually taking Taiwan, which is a pretty well reinforced island with only so many landing beaches, as far as I understand, and a reasonably well-trained force that is actually well on its toes. So doing that, even if you have all the firepower in the world and you can shoot away the enemy, then you still have to conquer it and the population, and you'll have a guerrilla war in Taiwan. I'm not so sure that that's a sort of a prospect you would want. I think that the threat of invading Taiwan gives much more than the actual invasion at the moment anyway. And this is, again, but I might be wrong here. I'm not a China expert. But I thought that the Russians were doing coercive diplomacy, and they were actually getting a lot out of it. But then they actually invaded for some reason. Right. I think the Chinese are now doing coercive diplomacy with Taiwan and get a lot out of it. But actually doing it later on, will they actually? I will leave it to the sinologists to sort of debate that one.
Yeah, one thing I would add, and I'm going to bring Alex in, is that we were having big arguments back in the fall about the interconnection between the the Chinese Taiwan issue and this. And now, of course, after Pelosi's visit and the upping of exercises essentially surrounding, enveloping Taiwan with air power and exercises so that they could essentially simulate a blockade, it sort of, and unfortunately, it raises the question of how this whole conflict is spilling over on a grand strategic scale, Alex. And of course, with the exercises off the coast of Venezuela, with Iranian, Russian, and Chinese vessels exercising together, it just raises a whole different kind of thing. Alex.
Yeah, Johan. So let me ask you about Russian employment of their officers. Because, of course, we've seen a lot of stories about, Russian generals getting killed. But my understanding is that's related to, the way the Russian army, going back to the Soviets works is, they expect their officers sometimes to be at the front to be, and necessarily like, to be, if there's a problem, say in a brigade, like, oh, the army commander may move forward again to, deal with it. And so I wonder if you agree with that. And then on the Ukrainian side, that they're basically kind of switched over to a NATO style of, again, the officers hanging back, especially, again, the higher ranking ones. And that's what may have led to, again, these cases of Ukrainian units, especially territorial defense, on video refusing to fight. And I think from what I've read, what happened in Lysychansk is that one unit basically left the, north of Popasnaya, left the line, and that basically is what started the avalanche that led to its encirclement. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
On the Ukrainian side, no. But on the other hand, given the scale and intensity and brutality of this war, that some officers simply fall through, perhaps isn't so strange. I mean, I have to ask myself, how on earth would I make it if I was in that mess? It's easy for me to sit here in Stockholm when I'm well fed and rested and everything is great, to have opinions on that. So I'll rest my case there. On the Russian side, yes, I've seen the reporting about killed officers. I think it's very much is made that means that there is problems at the front and the general has to go and solve it. Yes, that could be the case. But on the other hand, I've seen generals making frontline visits in the West too. I mean, so it's not unnatural that generals visit the front. And given the size of their operation, that several generals go there, not strange. I've heard that the general staff is now sort of rotating their senior people in and out of the operation, probably as some command levels lower down closer to the operation, which means that, the generals, if you're now suddenly taking over as chief logistics for the whole operations, of course you want to visit the field to see what it's like. So I'm not sure how much we should make of that. Just to add to what Jim said about exercises, yes, the Chinese exercise enveloped all of Taiwan. Yeah, but that's an exercise. In exercises, nobody shoots back. It's waving the big stick, but it's not using the big stick. And I think that sometimes we escalate ourselves or deter ourselves when we watch these exercises. They are mere statements of power, but they are not the execution of military power and the actual use of military force. They just show, look what we can do. But the military force, and when it comes to sort of the difference between exercise and war, in war people shoot back and they say, I want this more than you do, and I'll shoot you if you don't. That doesn't happen on exercises. Exercises are basically just swinging this big stick. And if we get upset every time the Russians have an exercise, we will sort of be upset all the time. So I think there's sometimes far too much reading of politics into exercises. And you can do that if you want, as long as you're honest saying this is my interpretation of events and my political take on it. Instead, because an exercise is essentially always collective training to fight wars.
Very good point. Very good point, Johan. Gary has the last comment. Go on, Gary.
Oh my, you gave me the last one. Well, yeah, I think if there's any lesson that we might learn, if we really need to learn this again, is just the whole inadvisability as being seen as an aggressor in any of these kind of situations. Whether or not some of the people who are making the charges, the loudest are guilty of hypocrisy for their past actions or whatever. It's just such a mistake, because if you look at the whole will thing on a sort of global scale, on a sort of moral scale, I just feel like it's just such a negative thing to overcome in the long term. And it just, I just feel like that's the ultimately Russia's going to be their downfall. No matter, even if they somehow pull off a complete military victory, in the long run, they're not going to be able to overcome that. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I think I mean, your final point is really good. Even if Russia wins militarily in Ukraine, and then you say that they declare a ceasefire, first a slight escalation and then ceasefire, and the whole world will be saying, yes, go for the ceasefire. Then we will basically cement Russia occupying another 20% of Ukrainian territory. We're having a Donbass plus situation, wait another 10 years, Russia builds its military power, and then go for Ukraine 3.0. So I think that, to sum up then, we have not seen the end of this for a long time. And even if the Russians get what they have now, they will have to safeguard it. They have to be able to defend it, to augment forces, etc., which means it's going to be a burden on their military. As long as they have this political obsession with Ukraine, it's going to cost. And it's actually quite good for the rest of us, because I think that the Russian ability to do two things at the same time will be limited. So for sounding purely selfish, and I know it sounds very cruel in a sense,
Yeah.
but it gives the rest of us a break. But that's a bigger reason for us also to keep on supporting Ukraine as much as we can. And not just in military terms, there's another thing that's very important, that is also the economic terms, etc., etc. So Ukraine survives not just as a fighting force, but as a sort of a reasonably viable state.
All right. Well, on that note, it has been our great pleasure to have basically used you like a sponge today, Johan. Basically, soaked you of all sorts of ideas. We didn't get the top secret information about Swedish meatballs, but we've had the great pleasure to have Johan Norberg, who's the senior military analyst at Sweden's Defense Research Agency, here to share a lot of his insights based on decades of work on examining the Russian armed forces along with his colleagues. And it was really terrific to hear all your thoughts today, Johan. Thanks a million.
Thank you all, gentlemen, and thank you for a great discussion. I very much enjoyed this. Yeah. Okay. Cheers, everybody. Yeah.